I now call to order the Society's 2,395th meeting in the 148th year since its founding in 1871. Good evening, everyone. My name is Larry Milstein. I'm the president of PSW, one of the oldest scientific societies of Washington, D.C., committed to providing a forum to further scientific understanding and inquiry. Welcome to our members and our guests to tonight's lecture by Jim Green in the John Wesley Powell Auditorium of the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C., including our members and friends around the world who are watching the live stream of tonight's meeting on PSW's YouTube channel. We will begin with a few announcements, a reading of the minutes of the 2,394th meeting on Cassini's spectacular Saturn. We will then turn to this evening's lecture, followed by a question and answer period, and thereafter I will present a small thank you gift to our speaker, make a few closing announcements, and adjourn the meeting to the social hour. First, please join me in thanking the sponsors of the 2018-2019 lecture series, Policy Studies Organization in cooperation with the American Public University, and a generous sponsor who has asked to remain anonymous. I am sad to note that Fred Spillhouse passed away recently. Fred was a longtime PSW member and served as president of the Society in 1982 and 1983, one of only 3 presidents at that time to serve for more than one term, and the first since Simon Newcomb served more than one term in 1879 and 1880. Fred was the executive director of the American Geophysical Union for almost 40 years, from 1970 to 2009. AGU under his leadership grew from 7,000 members to more than 56,000 members. Its net worth increased from going bankrupt to over $60 million. It started numerous new publications, including geophysical research letters. It initiated many new research workshops and meetings, and saw attendance at its annual meeting grow to over 20,000. He will be missed greatly, but AGU goes on, and they are having their annual meeting this year in Washington, D.C. I am pleased to announce that the following new members have been elected to the Society. Arina Payasova, a doctoral student at GW, interested in environmental studies. Savannah Crawford, a student in mathematics at George Mason University, a close friend of PSW, interested in math and the sciences. Michael Moore, a program executive at NASA, interested in astronomy and physics. Christian Sorensen, an aerospace engineering student interested in all things space. Tobin Koharziar, an engineer with Amazon interested in genetic engineering, nanotechnology, computing, and cryptography. Matthew Chervanik, an investor with Sunwater Capital, interested in a variety of topics related to science and the creation of knowledge. And tonight's speaker, Jim Green, whose background and interests will, in some small part, be clear to you from tonight's proceedings. Please join me in welcoming them all to membership. Any of our new members here tonight are invited to pick up your signed reprint of Volume 1 of the PSW Bulletin, if you did not already get one. Please see me after the lecture to obtain yours. Also, if any of you have purchased a rosette and have not yet picked it up or wish to purchase a rosette, please see the person at our rosette table in the back of the room at the end of the lecture. James Hillen will now read the minutes of the 87th Joseph Henry Lectures on Cassini's spectacular Saturn at the 2,394th meeting on June 15th.
Thank you, Larry. Good evening, everyone. On June 15, 2018, President Larry Milstein called the 2,394th meeting of the Society and the 87th Joseph Henry Lecture to order at 7:43 p.m. in the John Wesley Powell Auditorium of the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C. He announced the order of business, that the evening's lecture would be live-streamed on the internet, and welcomed new members to the Society. Vice President Mark Clampin then introduced the 5 speakers for the evening, representing NASA's Cassini mission to Saturn: Julie Webster, Philip Nicholson, Bonnie Baratti, Terry Herford, and Connor Nixon. Julie Webster is a manager of the Cassini Spacecraft Operations Office and chief engineer of the Juno mission to Jupiter. Webster said that after the first missions to fly by Saturn, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 both launched in 1977, scientists pursued an international collaboration for a dedicated return mission. That effort resulted in the 1997 launch of the Cassini Saturn Orbiter and Huygens Titan probe. Cassini carried a 4-meter-long antenna, 4 cameras, and 12 instruments, all of which ran on only 850 watts at launch. Over its 7-year journey to Saturn, Cassini relied on gravity assistance from Venus, Earth, and Jupiter. Once in Saturn orbit, Cassini engineers became so proficient in using gravity assistance from Titan as to extend the orbital mission from 4 to 13 years. Ultimately, Cassini's fuel depleted, and it plunged into Saturn on September 15, 2017. Philip Nicholson is a professor of astronomy and acting director of the Center for Astrophysics and Planetary Science at Cornell University. Nicholson focused his lecture on Cassini's final orbits through Saturn's rings and through its controlled demise. Cassini took high-resolution images and spectra revealing details of the rings' almost pure ice composition, density and bending waves in the rings, gap edges within the rings, and planetary oscillation modes inside Saturn. On its ultimate plunge through Saturn's atmosphere, Cassini took samples of the atmosphere, which are still under study. Bonnie Baratti is a principal scientist and technical manager at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and she served on the science teams for the Cassini and New Horizons missions. Of Saturn's 62 moons, Baratti talked about the 9 that she considers, quote, the weirdest planets in the solar system. Among these moons is Iapetus, which looks like a painted snowball. Cassini provided evidence for the Iapetus mystery by revealing that dark patches on the moon were created by dust from Saturn's outermost ring. Identifying a new mystery, Cassini observed unusual and unexplained red streaks across the surface of the moon, Tethys. Cassini also observed blue pearls on the moon Rhea, potentially created by a collapsed ring around the moon. Terry Herford is a planetary scientist in the Planetary Geology, Geophysics, and Geochemistry Lab at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. Herford spoke about Enceladus, an Arizona-sized moon inside Saturn's E-ring. Enceladus is cryovolcanically active, spewing debris that scientists now believe provided the material to create the E-ring. On a flyby, Cassini took high-resolution images of eruptions and surface fractures in the south polar region that experience a tension and compression cycle tied to the moon's orbital period. Scientists believe these stresses are enough to cause the surface fractures themselves. The thickness of Enceladus's water ice is unclear, and its interior contents are unknown. However, analysis of the moon's volcanic plumes suggests there is a liquid ocean under that ice, which may support life. And Connor Nixon is a planetary scientist at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center and the deputy principal investigator on Cassini's composite infrared spectrometer. Nixon spoke about the potential for life on Titan, Saturn's largest moon, characterized by its dense orange atmosphere. Cassini flew by Titan 127 times, taking observations on each pass. Those observations showed that Titan's ionosphere is predominantly carbon-based, and that nitrogen and methane in the atmosphere react with sunlight to create heavy orange molecules that shroud the moon in a dense smog. Using spectroscopic detections, Cassini also revealed Titan's complex molecular inventory that Nixon says may mirror that of life on Earth when life first formed. Cassini also collected evidence that, combined with observations from the Atacama Large Millimeter Array, confirmed the existence of vinyl cyanide that reacts with methane to form into spherical membranes, which could lead to the development of life. After a question and answer period, President Milstein thanked the speakers, made the usual housekeeping announcements, and invited guests to join the society. At 10:32 p.m., President Milstein adjourned the meeting to the social hour. Temperature, 27°C. Weather, sunny. Attendance, 162. Respectfully submitted, James Heelan, Recording Secretary.
Thank you, James. Are there any comments, corrections on the minutes? Hearing none, I will entertain a motion by a member to approve the minutes as read. All members in favor? All members in favor? All members opposed? The minutes are approved and will be posted to the website in due course. The 41st meeting of the Society was held on Saturday, February 15th, 1873. President Joseph Henry presided. As I've mentioned in past lectures, Henry was the preeminent American physicist and scientist of his time. He served as founding secretary of the Smithsonian Institution and founded and guided many important institutions of science. He did seminal work on electricity and magnetism, especially induction, and the fundamental unit of induction today is named for him, the Henry. His work had many practical applications and led to the invention of the telegraph. He was the founder, first, and longest-serving president of PSW, and I think we'll be hearing more about Joseph Henry in tonight's lecture. The bulletin reports 2 presentations at that meeting. M. Yarnell read a paper on a star catalog based on 25 years of observations made at the Naval Observatory. The paper was published in a journal called Washington Observations. I have nothing to report on Mr. Yarnell. If any member knows something about him, please tell me. William Harkness made a report on the power required to drive the pendulum of an astronomical clock, the latter being a clock that displays the motions of one or more astronomical objects. Like many members of the early PSW, Harkness was a notable figure of his time and had served in the Civil War. He was a surgeon in the Union Navy, was an aide at the Naval Observatory, served on the USS Monadnock, and reached the rank of Rear Admiral by the time he retired. After serving in the Navy, he served as the director of the Naval Observatory, developed a theory of achromatic lenses, invented various astronomical instruments, and participated in 2 expeditions to observe transits of Venus. He was president of the AAAS in 1893 and president of PSW in 1887. He never married and lived his entire productive life at the Cosmos Club, which was then located elsewhere. It's worth noting that there was considerable interest in ballooning among members of PSW. As an example, Cleveland Abbey made a presentation of one of the earlier PSW meetings on the use of ballooning to study the atmosphere in the Boston area that was reported to him by a fellow named King. And I believe that our speaker will tell us a little bit more about Mr. King later. I think it may be hard for us now, when satellite imagery is ubiquitous and never more than a click away, to imagine having to depend on land features alone to be able to look down on the Earth. The balloon, for the first time, allowed us to do that, and for the first time to measure properties of the atmosphere beyond the tops of mountains. Even today, balloons are being used to predict the weather, to study the atmosphere, and by getting above it, to study the cosmos as well. With that in mind, it will be particularly interesting to hear about the use of balloons in the Civil War. So we now turn to tonight's lecture on Aeronautical Beginnings, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, James L. Green. And you'll find out tonight Jim is an enthusiast and a scholar on the subject of ballooning in the 1880s and in the Civil War in particular. He can even dress the part. And in fact, here he is. You'll notice this outfit meets the requirements of the Cosmos Club with a tie and a jacket. And I dare say a bit more fashionable than some of the jackets I see members wearing today. Jim is the chief scientist at NASA. He joined NASA in 1880. 1880, yes.
Older than Joseph Henry.
He joined NASA in 1980 and has been there since, almost 4 decades. Before becoming chief scientist, Jim was director of the Planetary Science Division. During his tenure as director, he oversaw many seminal space missions. More recently among them, the spectacularly successful Mars Curiosity rover and the New Horizons mission to Pluto and the Kuiper Belt. Before becoming Planetary Science Director, Jim served as chief of the Space Science Data Operations Office, head of the National Space Science Data Center, and deputy project scientist on the IMAGE mission. In addition to his long involvement with NASA, Jim has had a passionate interest in the history of the Civil War, and ballooning in particular, and he's conducted research on Civil War balloons and ballooning for more than 25 years. Among other contributions, he worked with the Civil War Trust to identify balloon stations used in the Peninsula Campaign. He's written over 100 scientific articles on the Earth's and Jupiter's magnetospheres, and over 50 technical articles on data systems and networks. Among numerous awards and honors, he received the Fleming Award for outstanding individual performance in the federal government, Japan's Kotani Prize, and the National Exceptional Achievement Medal for the New Horizons flyby of Pluto. James earned his PhD in space physics at the University of Iowa. Please hold questions for the question and answer period at the end of the lecture, and join me in welcoming Jim to the podium.
Thank you very much, Larry. That was very generous.
Oh, that's yours.
All right.
There we go. Okay. You're good to go.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Well, it's just a delight to be here to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which really started when I was quite young. My grandmother had given me, when I was 12 years old, a picture book about the Civil War and said her father, my great-grandfather, was in the Civil War. And that really spurred me on to learn much more about it. And I really enjoy it as a pastime. I became quite interested, of course, in science in high school. I had some fabulous science teachers. I worked in an observatory. Was really hooked on astronomy and went to the University of Iowa and worked with James Van Allen. And of course, it's those kind of gravity assists one gets that propels you well into the field. But I never lost my love for history, and the Civil War in particular. Well, you know, Joseph Henry actually plays a very prominent role in tonight's talk. He was, as you all know, just as famous as Ben Franklin was in his own time. He was our first secretary of the Smithsonian Institute, the big red castle. And he was really quite a scientist in many regards, not only in the area of magnetic induction, which he helped along enormously in parallel with Faraday. But Faraday published first. That's one of the things you learn in science. You got to publish first. But he also really loved the science of the atmosphere and the weather and weather predictions. And this brought two loves together, and that was also his ability to connect with telegraph systems. He actually helped pioneer what telegraph systems could be, and they were developed He should have patented his thoughts in that area, but he didn't. And he used telegraph systems with a network of observers of climate. And since balloons could go 10, 20, 30,000 feet and make measurements, and that had started in the first half of the 1800s, he would also collect a variety of that data. And so, indeed, he was really quite a pioneer in collecting a set of observations for him to be able to understand weather patterns. And of course, what the balloons did is they provided a whole host of information from temperature, pressure, oxygen levels, air currents, wind direction, electrical charge, cloud heights, and a number of other features about these clouds. And indeed, he was quite prolific in constantly working in this particular area. The balloons would go up to about 30,000 feet, which is about 10 kilometers or so. And of course, these are really tough times for aeronauts to be able to stick it out in a gondola to go up that high, because the pressure is low. They pass out typically. It's also quite cold. And many died over that time period. But he did indeed collect those observations. All right, see what I did? Let's do that again. And indeed, the telegraph played an essential role to get him the information he needed. He had weather observers all over the place. So the two major technologies just prior to the Civil War that were really well known, of course, that are used extensively in the war, at least the early part of it, was the telegraph and, of course, the balloons, aeronautics. By the Civil War, in the late 1850s, we had about 150,000 kilometers, 125,000 kilometers, or is it miles? Miles, sorry, of telegraph line up and down the East Coast, not very far west, and then all over Europe. Now, Joseph Henry also, we were just debating tonight whether he installed a telegraph system in the castle or not. We're not quite sure that he did, or he ran back and forth in getting reports from the local telegraph office. But he certainly installed a magnetometer, and he made magnetic field measurements. Now, at this particular altitude, or latitude rather, the kind of things that he would observe are currents in the ionosphere and well beyond the ionosphere, out in the magnetosphere. Not knowing those are the kind of currents that they were measuring, he would see deflections and try to understand and relate these currents. This particular magnetometer went off scale during one of the most extensive geomagnetic storms of record. In 1859, an enormous storm occurred. Aurora went through Canada, went through the United States, producing huge currents, which, through induction, put huge currents on the telegraph wires, which overloaded the batteries. Some of these places actually burnt down because of the overload that occurred and the heat generated by them, and swept through the United States, swept through Mexico, and almost completely through Central America and ended in about Panama. And the aurora was red because all the high-energy particles that we call Van Allen radiation belts dumped into the atmosphere. They didn't know where these currents were coming from, but these were the kind of things, the fascinating things that were going on at the time. And Joseph Henry was really quite a central feature of that. On the aeronaut side, there were a number of aeronauts that really made many observations in weather, but that had gone on so well over previous decades that they were entering a new era. It was almost like they were barnstormers, okay? They were selling rides and fares and going up to altitude and doing a variety of fantastic things. Now, the telegraph actually, in the late 1800s, there was a big investment of connecting Europe with the United States over the Atlantic with a telegraph line. That was installed, worked for a very short period of time, and then died. And of course, economically, many people in the industry really wanted to see that succeed. The ability to get rapid information allowed them in many different ways to be able to be competitive, to be able to sell things on market, be able to be businessmen, and take advantage of this rapid mode of communication. So the aeronauts in a particular convention had decided the best thing they could do was demonstrate their ability to cross the Atlantic, since the telegraph wasn't working. And so there was quite a big push to be able to do that by many of the top aeronauts at the time. So the top aeronauts at the time in the late 1850s, like John Wise and John LeMountain, these two teamed together to create an enormous balloon that then they would demonstrate by crossing the Atlantic that they could do it in a matter of a short period of time, 15, 20, 30 hours, or whatever that time period is, and they didn't really know what it was going to take. They knew there's a general trend of a westerly wind that could take them over the ocean, and not really understanding the total hazards that are involved in that, but indeed they wanted to be able to do that in the late 1850s. And one way they could do that would be to test these concepts. So they built this enormous balloon called the Atlantic, and then they left St. Louis and then ended up coming down pretty hard in a remote area in upper New York, and the balloon was destroyed. That really broke up these two aeronauts. They couldn't seemed to cooperate from then on. They argued about who was responsible for the breakup. But since a major investment in the balloon was done by LeMountain, LeMountain took the Atlantic and remade it and created a much smaller balloon. In the meantime, another spectacular aeronaut was coming onto the scene, and this is Thaddeus Lowe. And Lowe, indeed, had an idea of creating a very large balloon, which he did. It was called the City of New York. This is the most massive balloon at the time, would lift 22 tons. And he was really working hard to anticipate any problems they may have as they were crossing the Atlantic. This would be as, if there were wind currents or they lost some of the gas in the balloon, they would have to come down. Perhaps they would need a vessel to be able to migrate into and then survive. And so consequently, they had this crazy design. But this was actually built. Lowe was quite an entrepreneur in being able to obtain funding from local businessmen. They really rallied around him, and they really worked hard to do this. The problem with doing it in New York, this is why I called it the City of New York, this is why he wanted to do it in New York, is the gas facilities couldn't produce enough gas to fill this balloon. Okay. Now, at the time, illumination gas is what you use. This is where you go into your home and you turn on your gas lamp and you light it, and it's carbonated hydrogen. It's generated from actually peat that you would heat and liberate this gas, and you would capture it. You'd put it in drums, and then you'd have wires out to the homes. Tubing out to the homes that then would do your gas lights, and that was city illumination. In many of these large cities, this is what was being installed all over the place. So the gas works, the local gas works, could provide this gas. And of course, taking the entire supply of New York City to try this experiment just wasn't going to work. So he actually renamed this balloon the Great Western, and then tried it again. Had a little bit of luck. But he lost the season of 1860. It was too late. And so he decided he needed some additional scientific advice, and he wrote a letter to John Henry. And so Henry wrote him back, and Henry said, look, you really got to do what some of these other aeronauts have done, and that is to test out the principle. Don't do the big leap. which Henry actually believed, Joseph Henry actually believed that he could do that, but really test it out and do a shorter run. And so Lowe said, okay, I'll have to design a smaller balloon with some of these features, but still, in terms of its construction, but still indeed prove out the principle. So that letter writing went back and forth, and they ended up with a really good, solid friendship from those correspondences. What happened next, of course, was states started seceding from the Union. South Carolina was first. Columbia was really the hotbed of secession, and then what followed was a whole series of secession of other states, firing on Fort Sumter on April 12th, really tore it. 2 days later, Lincoln put out a proclamation of we need some troops, called to the northern states to bring troops to the Washington, D.C. area. Now, Lincoln felt particularly vulnerable. Maryland was very pro-South, in particular Baltimore, and of course the Eastern Shore area was very pro-South, and so he felt that he had worked very hard to keep them in the Union. Virginia went, of course, one of the last states to leave the Union, and so he felt that Washington, D.C. was totally surrounded. And indeed, the newspapers that were coming out, the daily newspapers were saying, danger, the Confederate Army can mass and cross the Potomac and, capture the Capitol. So there was a lot of those kind of stories going on. So in the meantime, almost oblivious to the current events, Lowe from Cincinnati launches his balloon at 4 in the morning, okay? And he waits until the newspaper comes out. He gets a number of copies of the Cincinnati daily paper, which clearly demonstrates, here's the date, throws it in his balloon, and off he goes. And he actually ends up going anywhere from, we believe, from 14,000 feet up to about 15 or 16,000 feet. Although there is the general trend of the westerly current, he is blown off course. And so as you can see, it's a real disaster going from Cincinnati, here's where he wanted to go, Washington, D.C. area, and he ends up coming down into a town called Unionville, South Carolina, and of course a crowd amasses around him, and he's harassed, and finally he convinces them he's not a Union spy. There was a lot of talk of hanging him, and so cooler heads prevailed, and they did let him go. But what they did is put him on a train, and he went to Columbia. Okay, he went to the seat of the secession, and then he was in real trouble. Okay, he had a much higher bar of convincing. They threw him in jail, and fortunately, several professors from the local university came and recognized, since Henry and Lowe had been communicating, some of those communiques and some of the things that they'd been talking about ended up in publications like Scientific American and other newspapers. Once Lowe made that connection and talked about his communication with Joseph Henry, they then said, okay, we believe you, and indeed, he now was free to leave. What was happening at the time is he was trying to get a train to Washington, D.C., but the train was filling up with Confederate troops. And the train, he was told, is only going to stop at Manassas because we're amassing a large army, a large Confederate army in Manassas Junction. Okay, so you can't go there. Now, this is fantastic intelligence because, of course, what's going to happen next is Bull Run, from being launched from troops that end up being carried north and end up in Manassas Junction. So he doesn't recognize his ability to carry that intelligence forward, and he makes arrangements to work his way back to Cincinnati, going through Kentucky and Tennessee and Kentucky, and of course on up into Ohio, and get back into Cincinnati. Upon returning to his home, which is in Philadelphia, and recognizing the state of the Union and what was happening, he recognized that indeed many aeronauts are coming into the Washington, D.C. area. He writes Joseph Henry again, and Joseph Henry and Thaddeus Lowe, in these communications, Henry invites him down to Washington, D.C. to demonstrate to President Lincoln his ability. Now, in the meantime, the newspapers of the era were talking about ballooning and the importance of ballooning and how that's always the high ground. You ought to be able to see troop movements, many things you can do from balloons. Of course, these things were written by people that have never been in a balloon typically. But the aeronauts got it, and they started to come out in droves. And one of the first aeronauts to come down to Washington, D.C. was James Allen. Now, James Allen is from Rhode Island, born and raised in Providence, worked with King from Boston. And so Allen and King had their own aeronautic partnership, and they would fly balloons and do all kinds of things, and they were really well-known aeronauts. And as I mentioned, this is kind of the era of barnstorming, and they were doing that. But one of the things that they did wasn't so much barnstorming, but indeed, in 1860, they got together with a person that was a photographer, and off of Boston Commons went up and took the first photos from balloons in the United States. Okay, so James Allen had that kind of background. Those are the kind of things, and Allen was really quite the aeronaut. Lowe had just sort of gotten in the business, or was always interested in it, but the real aeronauts like Wise and LeMountain and Allen were hardcore aeronauts. And so James Allen joined a unit. The unit he joined was a Rhode Island unit. Rhode Island had their major general was Burnside. Burnside is well known with the large Burnsides, and indeed Burnside brought his men down, the Rhode Islanders, and they camped on Caton's Farm. Caton's Farm, this beautiful area. Where it is today is the corner of Florida in New York, okay? Just a little north of that metro stop that's there. And indeed, that was the farm area. In fact, this was a nice woodcut in some of the magazines, and you can see off in the distance the Capitol building, which hadn't been completed at the time. It was about half done. So Allen, like many of the men in these units, in these early units, had signed up for 3 months in the Civil War. That everyone thought 3 months ought to do it. We ought to win, and we'd all go home at the end of 3 months. So he was a 3-monther, and Burnside took him along everywhere. And they would go into Virginia, and they would camp after Lincoln decided he better take part of Virginia and create this buffer between the Confederate Army and himself. And so Allen would use illumination gas. Sometimes in Washington, but more often in Virginia, he would use the Alexandria facility and gas up, and then be towed out and observed from a tethered balloon. Now, typically these balloons would go up with one rope up to 400 or 500 feet early on in the war. The problem is because they're tethered and you'd have wind currents, they would spin. Okay, and so sometimes they were very difficult to observe from, and so that was always a problem. Allen had all kinds of problems. His balloons were old; they'd been used for many, many years. They were primarily cotton affairs with varnish to keep the gas airtight for a period of time that would last sometimes several days. with this illumination gas. These were not hot air balloons, okay, which you get heated, they go up to a certain altitude. As they cool, they come down, so they're very short-lived. These things, if they could hold the gas, would be lighter than air for significant periods of time and can be used for many hours, in fact, days. And so consequently, these were important, but right now, Allen wasn't cutting it. It just wasn't happening for him. So Lamountain was asked by Benjamin Butler, who became the general down here in Fortress Monroe, which the Confederates started taking everything in and around these areas that were held by the Union Army, but Fortress Monroe, they weren't able to take over. And then, of course, Butler felt they were completely surrounded by the Confederacy, didn't know when they would be invaded, and Fortress Monroe would fall. And so he contracts with John Lamountain to come down and be able to observe from the Fortress Monroe area. Now, Lamountain actually was tremendously successful. He made many repetitive flights, typically tethered, but Lamountain was really an adventurer. He loved to do free flights. You know, don't tether me, let me go. But because of the area that they're in the Hampton Roads area with the bottom of the Chesapeake, then he really had to go tethered. And in fact, because he liked the concept of mobility, he had Butler give him a ship called the Fanny, and he was launched off the Fanny and went around, moved around in this particular area. This actually is one of his sketches. It's a very famous sketch that he did. And so he really was doing quite well. Once again, one balloon connected to a general or corps or even a brigade like Burnside, but nothing that would cut across the entire Union Army. And this is what Henry felt needed to be done. So Henry finally encouraged Lowe to come down. Lowe came down from Philadelphia, where he was stationed, there's where his home was. And here's what the mall looked like at the time, okay? So you had the castle, a very large green park-like area, but there was the canal. The C&O Canal ran right through the mall, okay? So Lowe came down and stayed in the Willard Hotel. Here was the gas works. Here was the city gas works. So this is where they would have illumination gas, pump it into the city. And so it was a real natural working with Henry, who got the permit that allowed Lowe to launch from this mall area, okay, launch a balloon, indeed, to be able to perform a demonstration. So what kind of demonstration could you do from a balloon that hadn't been done already? The papers were sensationalizing what Lamountain was doing, and Allen was having failure, so it was easy to be able to outdo Allen. But Lowe decided what he would do is, once again, taking a book from Henry, why don't I fly a telegraph? And so using $250, and it's kind of debatable how he got that, but I believe he got it from Joseph Henry, the Smithsonian, and also acquiring a variety of men in the service who are now flooding into Washington, D.C. area to be able to hold the ropes and man the balloon. He went up to 500 feet with a telegraph operator and his supervisor, who absolutely had to go with him. And then from there, indeed, he telegraphed Abraham Lincoln. All right? So this is the first message from space, so to speak, that came down. So I love the parallels. And indeed, as you can see, where these things connect. So the old gas works were right here. This is where the American Indian Museum is. Okay. So here is the Air and Space Museum. So right in this particular area was just the perfect area for Lowe to be able to go and launch his balloon, and then send that telegraph. And here's a sort of a sketch. Lowe really loved to be able to also advertise. He was really quite the showman, and he would indeed take up flags and really say, here, you know, I'm a man from the Union. What we did at the 100-year anniversary is recreate that down on the mall. So I have several of my compatriots here. Tom Crouch really made this happen, and Kurt Westergaard came with his capability, which is a tethered system that will go up about 500 feet. They were able to get the airspace to be able to do that. This is an image from Kurt's system that was flown. Here is what was down on the mall right in front of the Air and Space Museum. So it's really a tremendous time. What you can see this dedication by a plaque that's put right on the side of the walkway as you come up. You can see it right on the granite railing area as you walk up into the museum. And so indeed, it just was a wonderful opportunity. This is pretty close to what Lowe saw at about 500 feet from a modern view. And of course, you could easily see the White House. White House is buried up here. You can look into Virginia. You can do that. You have beautiful views right below you. And so here is the actual telegram that was taken down and brought over to Abraham Lincoln. And so this was just tremendously exciting at the time. In fact, here's Kurt's capability right here that was launched in a side street. And then you can see it flying, even though we had a demonstration balloon on the mall that was being inflated by Kevin Knapp, who is one of the major balloon chorists that does indeed do reenactments of the balloon activity. Here's what the telegram says. To the President of the United States. This point of observation commands an area nearly 50 miles in diameter. The city with its girdle of encampments presents a superb scene. I have the pleasure in sending you the first dispatch ever telegraphed from an aerial station, and in acknowledging indebtedness to your encouragement for the opportunity of demonstrating the availability of the science of aeronautics in the military service of the country. Lincoln was so excited about this that indeed he invited Lowe to come over to the White House. So Lowe brought this balloon, the Enterprise, that he made, and moored it out back of the White House, okay? Put a net over it and secured it to the ground, and then had dinner and late evening conversations with President Lincoln about the importance of balloon observations. What was emerging from these conversations is indeed the importance of ballooning, but also the importance of managing them as a unit of the Army. Okay, as a unit that can be dispersed to various places, not individual units or corps that would have their own balloons, but something that was flexible that you could take to the right location and make the right observations. Now, in Lowe's telegram, balloonists already are wincing a little bit because you can tell he loves to exaggerate. From a balloon at 400 or 500 feet, you can only see really well about 10 miles, okay? At top altitude that you would go in these tethered balloons 1,000 feet, you could see maybe 15, 20 miles, all right? But what's happening, of course, is that's a great distance because it takes an army a day to move 15 miles, okay? So the balloons Lincoln really liked because it's very simple. If we had an array of balloons in the Washington, D.C. area, indeed, we can gather that intelligence and then be able to keep Washington, D.C. safe, okay? Now, in the meantime, even though Lincoln became very enamored with Henry's choice to run the Balloon Corps, which was Lowe, in the meantime, the topographical engineers, in true fashion, did their own thing. And so they hired John Wise. John Wise was a really well-known balloonist. far more in the science area. I mean, a number of wonderful scientific observations from balloon, had already written a very well-known book about ballooning. And so Wise was indeed hired by the topographical engineers to indeed go with them and go into Virginia and do more observations. The Union Army, you know, from Rhode Island and New York and all these places north, didn't really follow the roads in Virginia. There was no Google Maps around. They had to create them, all right? And that means you did that from above. You made your maps, and so the balloons, it's associated with the topographical engineers, sounded like just the absolute perfect thing to do, because that would be an immediate utility. In addition to spotting troop movements, making accurate maps that allowed them to move around was just absolutely ideal. So, in and around the time of First Manassas, or Bull Run, as the troops, the Southern troops were accumulating in the Manassas area, which Lowe already knew was happening, whether he really recognized what was occurring or not from a military standpoint. But indeed, Wise was asked to rush out to the Bull Run area. So he went to the gas works, and Thaddeus Lowe was sitting at the gas works at the time, actually filling his balloon. He was still doing a variety of demonstrations. Lincoln and Lincoln's top general, General Scott, wanted him to demonstrate his utility to a number of other units, a number of other generals. And so Lowe was doing this, and he was doing it on his own money initially. But Wise was really paid for. This was the first balloon that was paid for by the American government. Wise called it the war balloon. And so, excuse me, what happened next was, because Wise's balloon needed to be inflated, and he had a job to do and was hired by the federal government, they forced Lowe to disengage, and the gas works filled Wise's balloon, was attached to the wagon, and off they went towards Manassas. And unfortunately, as they were running down the road, the balloon got captured between trees and was torn apart. Absolutely torn apart. And Wise was beside himself. He just couldn't talk sense into the men that were detailed to him to help manage the logistics of these balloons. And he was so frustrated, he told Whipple, who had hired him into the topographical engineers, "Forget it, I'm done. Okay, I'm out of here." And so that left room for Thaddeus Lowe. Now Lowe ends up being the chief aeronaut after Wise. And Lowe knows what he wants to do. He's already had enough experience to know that these tethered balloons flapping in the wind have to be strong. So they're going to have to be double silked. The seams are going to have to be done in a particular way to withstand the strain. He went out and he developed a very good varnish that could hold this illumination gas for much longer than many of these other balloons, typically the cotton balloons in particular. And so he had already started the design of these new military balloons. He became the United States chief aeronaut, okay? And of course, General Scott was out, General McClellan was in, and Lowe and McClellan formed a fast relationship. And so whatever Lowe wanted, McClellan granted. And the first thing he wanted was enough money to go make 7 new balloons. And he got that money. And so here are what these balloons are. The first Army balloon he made was the Union. This is a huge balloon, 35 feet wide, 45 feet high, 32,000 cubic feet gas, lifts 4 cables. It takes the cables up and has a gondola of 5 men. So what Lowe also recognized is one tethered line wasn't going to work. You needed at least 3 lines to be able to maintain a rigid platform to do the observations, not spin in the wind, okay? And therefore, that put more strain on the balloon. So this was the first balloon they made. Of course, cost the federal government a chunk of bucks, $1,500. The next one he made was the same size. It's called the Intrepid. This is actually a very famous balloon. It makes a number of really key and important observations on the peninsula. We'll talk a little bit about that. He also makes the Constitution, all right? And the Constitution has, is brightly painted. And I should have mentioned this earlier. Each of Lowe's balloons, indeed, are labeled. They're brightly painted. They're not, army gray or, any of that stuff that is trying to hide up in the sky. Lowe did not want to hide. His whole idea is also intimidation. The ability to go up 500 feet, 1,000 feet, and have the Southern Army see him is what he wanted. He wanted everybody on the ground to be able to see him and his balloons. And of course, from a Confederate perspective, if you could see the balloon, then the balloon occupants must be able to see you, right? Okay, well, if you've been in a balloon, you know how hard that really is. But that was a really important element of intimidation. So these had to be brightly colored. They had to be spectacular balloons, spectacular in their design. And of course, this is the Freedom, which is sitting on top of the Capitol. He grabbed every design he could get. The United States, a slightly smaller balloon with beautiful eagles. Another smaller balloon, very famous, is the Washington. Now this one would carry 2 men, so he created a new gondola in size, 20,000 cubic feet gas capacity. Beautiful balloon. And then 2 others, the Excelsior, much smaller, really a one-person balloon, and then the Eagle. Also, actually, the Eagle's a fairly famous balloon, too, based on where these balloons were and the observations they made. Now, as you can see, he created a series of sizes. And the concept is that the Army moves and he goes with particular units or corps, and they decide they need some observations. He can quickly inflate the smaller balloons, get up, start a series of observations while they're inflating the larger balloons that will then take up more than one occupant, but also take up the map makers. Many generals would go up and observe with Lowe, and so this was a part of his strategy. Now, if you have that many balloons, you're going to need some aeronauts. And so he hires James Allen. And in fact, he hires James Allen's brother, Ezra Allen, also. William Poland, John Dickinson, and Jacob Furneaux. Don't have pictures of them. But Ebenezer Seaver, John Steiner, Joseph Starkweather. He was given Le Mountain, okay? They decided once they created a corps with a set of balloonists, then Le Mountain was going to be reporting to Lowe, and Lowe hated Le Mountain and vice versa. They fought constantly, okay, and that produced enormous problems. But the rest of these men, Seaver and Allen and Steiner and Starkweather, really got along well with Lowe. Now Lowe thought of himself as an engineer, but thought of himself as a scientist. He's not really a scientist. He's an engineer. But he's an engineer extraordinaire, okay? And so the next concept that he came up with is gas generators. Now, not every place they're going to go with these armies are going to have, the local gas works. Only these larger towns have gas works. And so he needs to be able to take into the field something that will generate illumination gas. Since you're going to generate it, you want even something purer than illumination gas. And so he came up with a fabulous method. It had been known for some time, and he perfected it, and he created these gas generators, these large boxes. What's in these boxes are shelves that you would then put in iron filings, and then pour from the top, into the top, a diluted solution. So you needed water of sulfuric acid. So it's, for the chemists, it's Fe plus H2SO4. That's an exothermic reaction. The iron acquires the oxygen, and you pop off the hydrogen, and the hydrogen comes out hot. You then go through these scrubbers. So there's like baking soda that's sitting in here. So coming out of these containers, of course, of this hot gas, go through a scrubber, then go through a cooler, which is basically an area where water can flow in and around a container of gas that's moving in and out of that, cooling it. And so you needed running water to continue to do that. And then that would go into the balloon. So this was fantastic. He made 12 of them, okay, made 12 of them. These gas generators. Let's see. I think we can see it now. I guess we can't see these on the other side of the containers. He numbers them. Okay, and so some of the period photos you can actually see which gas generator is doing what. And so here we have out in the field. So this is an image, a very famous image of Lowe inflating one of these balloons. So this is how they did it. Netting to secure the balloon. They needed a ground cloth. The story goes that once he became head aeronaut, the Army thought, okay, this would be great. You're obviously going to need war balloon. Okay, that was a balloon that we paid for. And they brought it over and gave it to Lowe. This was the balloon that popped. Beautiful blue balloon, war balloon by John Wise, who Lowe also didn't like. And Lowe said, great, that's fantastic. And he used it as a ground cloth so that everyone, could step on it. And, he hammered it into the ground, and, it was secured. That's the way he thought about these things. And they'd fill the balloons. They could do this in about 3 hours to really big balloons like the Intrepid. Well, that's remarkable, particularly with 2 gas generators. Now, here's a stream that runs by. So, indeed, these are detailed men from the local force, wherever he was assigned to, that were brought in. He would train them on how to do this. And they're manning the gas generators. Actually, you can see this one. There's an overflow going on right now. So this thing is running hot. Right now, it's doing that, and that gas is flowing in. It's filling up the lines, going into the scrubber, going into the cooler, and going right into the balloons, as you can see it now. All right. So these period pictures were taken. This one in particular was taken in the Gaines Mill Farm, and I'll talk more about that because there's a number of famous things that happened in and around that area. He also came up with a series of how to manage these balloons. So when he was assigned a place to go observe, he would go to that local general, and of course he'd have his orders from McClellan. McClellan would say, give Lowe whatever he wanted, and the first thing he wanted would be detailed to him 30 or more men. Okay. Now, because he would launch the balloons with 3 lines, as you see here, he would have 10 men a line. So he'd teach them how to inflate the balloons, and then how to manage the balloons. And the balloons then could be inflated, and then from the lines be brought to where they needed to be, brought into a close battle area or near a battle area to be launched to higher altitudes, and then tied off. Typically tied them off with trees. Now, Lowe also, with his set of equipment, had telegraph equipment, although he didn't take telegraphs up with him all the time. He does in a couple very important, well-known instances, but in most of the time he doesn't. So here's another staged picture, actually, of Lowe writing a report that will be delivered by horse to that general. Now, when he's at altitude, he would write up his intelligence, usually wrap it in a bullet, and then slide it down a guy wire, and then they would pick it up and then deliver it as a message. And that went on for many, many, many observations. Now, he also on a train ride from Washington, D.C. up to Philadelphia, where they actually were making the balloons in his factory, knowing what LeMountain had did in terms of using the fanny to tow a balloon, Lowe decided he was going to do one better. He was going to make an aircraft carrier, okay? And so that's what he did. This is actually the first aircraft carrier. Here it is. This is his sketch. This is right out of the archive. This is the sketch of the boat where you're actually tethered. You go up, and then you're towed. You're towed up and down whatever river you're looking at whatever altitude. And in fact, you could even have on the boat gas generators and make observations from that. Now here's another very famous period sketch of the Washington. Washington seemed to be just sort of the right size for this system. He went to the Navy Yard when he was in Washington, D.C. after he showed McClellan this sketch, and McClellan said, go make it, go have it made. He went to the Navy Yard and worked with Dahlgren, and they got a boat called the G.W. Parke Custis. Okay, now the G.W. Parke Custis sounds like a Confederate boat to me, because G.W. Parke, the Custis farm is Arlington. Okay, this is the big Arlington house. Lee married Custis. That was their home, all right? And on that property, this boat was connected with, and it was named after her father, George Washington Parke Custis, and he would use this boat to haul crops up and down the Potomac, bring people over to his farm. And he didn't really have any bridges early on in this era to bring people over to Arlington. And so consequently, Lowe loved that idea, kept the name, had them rip off the superstructure, deck it, okay? And in fact, they were going to do this anyway. They were going to use it as a coal barge and take coal out to the big ships that couldn't come into the Navy Yard. And so he was given it and used it quite effectively in many ways. And of course, here's another sketch where they actually have two gas generators. So these gas generators that he made were made just right to be able to sit on the chassis of an army wagon and then move back and forth, but you actually can take them off and put them on a deck. So very versatile. Man, this guy was really set up. So he really started doing what Lincoln wanted him to do, which was really start keeping Washington safe. So indeed, he created a whole series of places for observations. So the G.W. Parke Custis came down the Potomac and created the station at Budd's Ferry. And at Budd's Ferry, he had Pullen and Seaver. And of course, Lowe was a contractor. He could hire whoever he wanted to. So he hired his father, Clovis. So Clovis was there, and then LeMountain. He didn't really care much about where LeMountain went. So LeMountain ended up connecting himself with Franklin, a major general in the Union Army, and they were camped in and around this area. So he stayed at Cloud's Mill. And so that's where he was. But Edwards Ferry, which was a wonderful little ferry that you could cross the Potomac. In fact, if you draw a line between Rockville and Leesburg, goes right through Edwards Ferry. Now, early on in the war, since Lincoln was able to take over this part of the Washington, D.C. area, well into Virginia, then the way intelligence, spies obtaining important intelligence in Washington, D.C., how they would have to get their information over in Virginia, would actually be up here to Edwards Ferry and then out and then over to Leesburg. And of course, McClellan didn't like that, tried to stop it, had a corps go up by General Stone. There was a very famous interaction that was called Battle of Ball's Bluff, just below Edwards Ferry. It was a real disaster. And so eventually he had Low take up one of his balloons so he could see what was happening on the other side here. So this is fantastic intelligence. This really provides a set of observations all up and down the Potomac very early on in the Civil War. And they would take treks out to certain places like Fairfax Courthouse and in other places. Here's the balloon at Clouds Mill. They would fill it in the Alexandria Gas Works, work their way through town, and then out to these locations. Really spectacular. And down in Budd's Ferry, they would fly at night, and in fact, just to look and see if what was going on in the river, they used cadmium lights invented by a Professor Grant, who was also connected with Low's group for a small period of time. And they just really did some really creative and inventive ways. Now, one of the reasons why the observations up and down the Potomac were really important is because the Confederates built a whole series of forts along the Potomac to blockade Washington, D.C. Okay? So if you wanted to supply material, food, and other materials into Washington, D.C. One of the best ways, of course, is by water. That's what they did up the Potomac. But on the Virginia side, if you had a whole series of forts, anything that was going up the Potomac, you were running the gauntlet. So we talk about, the big blockade that Lincoln had of the South on the Atlantic side. But in reality, the Confederates did it first, and they did it blockading the Potomac. And although they didn't sink anything, they sure tried hard. And it really did mean that each of these captains had to think twice before they'd run the gauntlet. That produced greater reliance on other methods, such as the railroad getting in and out of Washington, D.C. Now, what they would do in the balloons, Poland would have a number of men go up. This one is William Small from the 26th Pennsylvania Infantry, who was an artist, loved to sketch. This is also a period sketch. Where he would make note the structures and the number of men and the fortifications and things that are in and around on the other side. Low would finally had completed his fleet of balloons, and with the small ones built last, and he tested all the small balloons here at Powick Church, and this was a great place to test them. Then he was really in good state. In March 1862, Lincoln was so pressuring McClellan to get busy and invade more of the Confederacy that indeed McClellan hatched a plan to go down to the area called the Peninsula and work his way up to Richmond, which is up here. So the James River actually goes through Richmond. And so between New York and the James River, here's Fortress Monroe. We have a toehold there. If we can just bring men down here and then begin to go up the peninsula and knock off Richmond, maybe we can stop the war. So this is March 1862. Now, what happened in early March 1862, right here in Hampton Roads, was the Battle of the Monitor and the Merrimack, okay? Really changed, once again, the technologies of ironclads fighting each other. And indeed, that battle went on for 2 days, late in one day and a good chunk of the next day, over a 2-day period, with it being a draw. The Confederate Merrimack, which is right here, also called the Virginia, went and into one of these rivers to hide. And now McClellan is going to bring his troops down here, and a lot of ships, thousands of ships bringing his men down the Potomac. So the first thing he wanted to do is know where the Merrimack is. So he had Low take one of his aeronauts and indeed bring him down to Fortress Monroe, launch a balloon from this particular area to look and see what's happening in anticipation that the Merrimack would come around the corner, sink his troop his troop ships coming down. That wouldn't work out too good. Now, all during this time, as these men are just filing into this area, and they would come down to Hampton Roads, this particular town which the Confederates left, and they burned to the ground, literally. They would come in here. That's where they would start their trek up the peninsula. The Merrimack stayed put. The Merrimack stayed put. And whether the balloons intimidated them or what the problem was, maybe they're mechanical problems and they couldn't get it operational, McClellan was able to bring down at least 90,000 men, okay? So now he has an enormous army and he's making his way up the peninsula. And the first area he comes up to is already blockaded across the peninsula by the Confederate Army with the anchor at a place called Yorktown. All right? Of course, this is the famous Yorktown of the Revolutionary War, where the British Army surrendered, and it really marked the death of that fighting and of course then the founding of America to be complete. So Lowe set up a balloon in this particular area. The G.W. Parke Custis came in here and stayed in Wormsley's Creek. There actually is a little creek that runs down here that's pretty rapid. Nice little ravine. He could bring his balloon down, fill it, and get it become operational. And so this whole area came to a standstill. The Union Army wouldn't move past the fortifications that were anchored here at Yorktown and across to the James River, from the York River to the James River. And Lowe would have daily observations, and he'd go up at night even. He'd want to go up at night because at night he could count the campfires. So you know how many Confederates you can get around a campfire? About 10. So you can say, okay, this road is where they are. There's none over here. And he would love the newspaper reporters. They would just go with him everywhere. And he would, they would write stories that'd be in, the New York Times or the Philadelphia Inquirer, and then 2 or 3 days, those papers would filter into the Confederacy, and of course Robert E. Lee would be reading them with his eyes wide open and decide he was going to have the Confederate Army build certain fires along one road and forbid his army to have fires in another area, okay? And that happened on several occasions. So the concept of intelligence that can be acquired from the balloons and actionable was not effectively done. And in fact, many of these aeronauts, when they would go up, they would be told, well, just tell me what you see. Well, if you get up in a balloon, you can see everything. What do you want to see? What do you want to know? Do you want to know how occupied this road is? Do you want to know troop movements? Do you know what area should I be concentrating on? So the concept of tasking the balloonists to gather the right intelligence wasn't happening, okay? That was probably one of the biggest faults of the balloons. Now, Lowe, who would go up with a lot of generals and really get a feeling for how this would go, and several of these generals got to be really good balloonists too, by the way. Fitzjohn Porter is one of them, which is another great story I won't have time to tell, but he recognized how hard this was, and he would constantly ask, because he wouldn't be tasked, he would constantly ask for generals to come and go up on the balloon, see what they wanted to see, and then that could be actionable. Okay? So that was a huge standoff, and so not knowing what was happening over here and how bad the James River was going to be held by the Confederacy, McClellan wanted Lowe to establish another balloon station, which he did at a place called Warwick Courthouse. So Warwick Courthouse, he had Allen come down and manage that particular area. Now, there's some really great stories about what happened in and around Warwick Courthouse because a general to a staff, I think he was a colonel at the time, was really outgoing, really flamboyant, wanted to get in balloons, wanted to get involved, and that was George Armstrong Custer. And so Allen took Custer up in a balloon, and during the very first flight, Custer cowered at the bottom of the bag, okay? So the Custer, the lion that we hear so much about and know so much about, laying in the bottom of the basket, complaining about, a possible death at any minute, with the basket falling apart and him falling through. Alan then deciding, okay, well, jumping up and down in the basket to demonstrate that that wasn't going to happen, finally overcame his fear, and he was able to then talk to Alan and really get his balloon legs, if you will, and really liked it. And Alan just let him go, man. So whenever Custer wanted to get up into a balloon, he really had easy access to it, and that was this one at Warwick Courthouse, which was the very famous area for observations. And then here's Lowe's area. Now McClellan was trying to do Army-Navy operations, okay? So he talked with Goldborough, who was the admiral of this particular fleet in this area. He said, we want you to run by Yorktown. We don't think there's many guns here. They're all pointing this way, and if you run by Yorktown and we can get on the other side of it, then we think Yorktown will fall. And if Yorktown falls, the whole line will go and we'll be able to push up. Goldborough refused to do that. Refused to put his ships at risk and run that gauntlet. And the observations from the balloons seem to indicate that the longer they started delaying that tactic, the more guns would be on that side. And indeed, that's what happened over time to make Goldborough correct, by just waiting McClellan out. So that was how that went. Now there's some really beautiful period sketches. Many of these woodcuts I'm showing you are actually from some of the illustrated papers that were of the time. Here's the Yorktown area, and this is the balloon area. On the evening of May 4th, and I mean like early evening, George Armstrong Custer goes up in the balloon at Warwick Courthouse and observes the Confederates leaving Yorktown, okay? And so he alerts, he puts down a message, drops a message, telegraph goes and communicates up to McClellan's headquarters that the Confederates are leaving Yorktown. And so Lowe is then tasked to go on up in his balloon and verify the report from the Warwick balloon that indeed the Confederates are leaving, and he does. And so now the Confederates are falling back. And the reason why they were falling back, it was now pretty well known that McClellan, who was bringing up enormous artillery that would really decimate the line and decimate Yorktown, was getting ready in another day or two to take that task on. So they already knew they had lost, but they delayed the Army's motion up as far as they could while they were continuing to bring troops into the area. And so indeed, the line fell, the Confederate Army fell back, and McClellan and the group came into Yorktown. And so what we then wanted to do, what McClellan then wanted to do, was to take a group of men and go up the York River as far as you can and land as close to Richmond as you could, okay? And so Lowe was in that group, and indeed the G.W. Parke Custis, they towed him up the river, and they had a small skirmish at West Point. That's not in this area, it's Yorktown area. So it goes up to pretty high up the Potomac, the York River, to a place called it's called the White House. It's really an old homestead of George Washington, okay, also called the Confederate White House, and here it is. And now they're making landfall, and this is also a period sketch of Lowe's gas generators coming on, and then moving inland. Now, so so here's Richmond now. Now they're up the York River, and crossing now towards Richmond. They settle in a particular area on the Gaines property, and then as soon as Lowe gets established there, has a number of generals go up, and they really do some exciting things. There's Stoneman and his cavalry use some of that intelligence to then clear out out some of these areas that allow them to get access to some of these bridges, this one in particular. But now they're moving forward again. And up here in Mechanicsville, Lowe is able to establish another balloon station. So now Lowe has two major balloon stations. He's going to manage this one in this area, and he has Allen up at the Mechanicsville balloon area. Now, Mechanicsville balloon, as you can see here, is so close to Richmond that people in Richmond writing letters home or their diaries are filled with the fear of seeing these Union balloons off in the distance. They're right there in front of them. Okay, so they go to church, and of course they see the balloons. They think the balloons are counting the people going into, into the church. And so this is really a tremendous fear factor that was going on. You can read this in several major diaries. So the Confederate Army is amassing in these parapets and areas in and around Richmond, and then there's a major fight at Fair Oaks where the two armies clashed. During this particular time, there were 3 balloons in the air, 2 that were Lowe's, but 1 that was a Confederate balloon. So they built a balloon from dressed silk. They took reams of this silk before it was made into dresses. It's not like they ran around robbing people's dresses, but they took this dressed silk. It was quite the patchwork of material, and they filled it with illumination gas, which is sitting right in Richmond on the Richmond Railroad. They had a flat car. They put this balloon there. Porter Alexander was the aeronaut. They filled that balloon, hoisted it up off this flat car, ran it down the peninsula, and so there was a Confederate balloon also watching this fight, and 2 Union balloons. So Lowe, in one of the Union balloons at the Gaines Mill Farm, had his telegraph operator there. And it's not well known, but it came out in a couple newspapers that Lowe's telegraph, which was connected to McClellan's headquarters, and McClellan's headquarters was connected to the War Department, and Lincoln loved to go into the telegraph office. The supposition is, and I haven't been able to verify that, but the telegraph was actually communicating back to Washington, D.C. through McClellan's headquarters, and so Lincoln and Stanton were reading telegrams about a battle that was happening 100 or more miles south of them in real time through this capability. Really forward thinking. McClellan decided, okay, what's our best step? Our best step would be to divide his army in half and move across the Chickahominy. Now, I don't know what book you read that out of, but, breaking up your army and moving it around doesn't always work. So he had Lowe create another balloon station. Now, Lowe had all these balloons with him, so it was easy for him to be able to, get the material off the G.W. Parke Custis and move it out to a station and create it. And so during a really tremendous rainstorm, when the Chickahominy, you can see there's hardly anybody living in and around the Chickahominy because it overflows its banks and ends up being a swamp in this area. This huge rain comes, fills this particular area. Although he's got 3 balloons up, what happened in the Battle of Fair Oaks is the main Confederate general, Joe Johnston, gets wounded, and Robert E. Lee is assigned to take over. And so Robert E. Lee is not going to be Joe Johnston. He's going to be aggressive. He's not going to fall back. He's going to move forward. What he does is amass an army and comes right over here and then starts knocking this whole area off, okay? So Allen goes up in his balloon, and as he's going up in the balloon, he sees Confederates coming at him. He's being fired at constantly. He's yelling down, haul me down, and they, having trouble figuring out why. I'm just trying to get you up. The detailed men are doing that. So Allen, as an aeronaut and certainly not afraid of heights, at probably several hundred feet, decides, if I stay here, I'm dead. Jumps out of the balloon and slides down the guy wire, okay? Now, the Confederates see this, and it's reported in a number of papers that they shot this aeronaut out of the balloon, but they didn't. Allen survived and lives long and is an aeronaut his whole life. And so they pack up and they leave this particular area. In the meantime, they just keep moving. It's a really juggernaut. So the next big station, of course, is the Gaines Mill Station. So it's the famous photo, as we talked about earlier. Right there is Poet Creek that comes through here is the Gaines Mill Farm. And in fact, this is the area that Tom Crouch and I found in the late 1990s and is now purchased by the Civil War Trust and is a protected property. It will be probably turned over to the National Park Service in another several years. But quite a fabulous balloon station. In the meantime, the Army is just pouring over this particular area. So Allen gets all his equipment out, but Lowe, who's not at this area, he's actually physically over at the Trent House, has to rely on his the detailed men to be able to pull the balloon core out of this area and get it across the Chickahominy and over to the Trent House. Well, they weren't able to get everything out. They actually left 2 gas generators there and a whole series of equipment that they tried to bury, and they got the balloon and the basket out and moved out of that area. In the meantime, Longstreet's men comes by here. There's a number of reports of where these men are walking by Lowe's gas generators, you know, as they're coming up the hill, and then hammering the Union Army. So this is the property they bought. This is from the Civil War Trust. This is the property they bought, and indeed it does contain this very famous balloon station. So here's the Trent House, also a period of sketch. They were alarmed. They saw what was happening, and indeed, as men were pouring back into this particular area and fortifying it, Lowe discovered he loses 2 gas generators. Several days later, those 2 gas generators end up in the square in Richmond, okay, on display, okay? And so the newspapers, instead of talking about the gloom and doom of the balloons and the observations, here is the parts of the balloon station that they were able to recover. Now, the Confederate Army could have used them, okay, could have used them, but they didn't either understand their purpose to the extent of being able to make them an effective use in filling balloons in a portable way. They didn't have the resources or the abilities or the aeronauts volunteering to come in and really create an air force. They were only reacting to what the Union Army was doing. If the Union Army did this, then they would try and marshal resources to be able to counter that and do the same thing. In the meantime, Lee takes the Union Army on in a series of battles called the 7-Day Battles and constantly pushes him back, pushes him back, pushes him back. And so they end up, after this whole maneuver, this beautiful set of maneuvers that they did from Yorktown, falling back, and all the activity in and around Richmond, they end up moving to Berkeley Plantation right here. And that's they had a huge battle at Malvern Hill. In fact, we have no records of any balloon observations at Malvern Hill other than James Allen, who names his son, his middle name of his son, Malvern. He obviously saw this battle, and he had to see it from a balloon since his operation was always behind the lines. Just before this particular battle, Thaddeus Lowe comes down with malaria. Of course, this is just a huge mosquito problem. Malaria is all rampant in this particular area. Lowe ends up with malaria, goes back to Philadelphia to try to recoup, and he turns over the entire balloon operation to James Allen. Now, there was quite a bit of discussion in Scientific American and a whole series of magazines about why aren't they using photographs? Why aren't they taking photos from these balloons, okay? We have searched very hard. We can't find one photograph in the Civil War era from a balloon, okay? But I think it happened. I think it happened. And the guy to do it was Allen. He was with Allen and King when they made the first photographs in the Boston area. And when they eventually leave this area and go back to Washington, D.C., the set of equipment that they labeled, that they're returning back into the depot, contains a whole series of photographic equipment. So I think Allen took that opportunity to have several flights to go up and really get some spectacular images of that area. Maybe they were all broken, you know, they're glass plates, and maybe it was why they don't survive. But it would be wonderful to find them. So here they are. So here's a beautiful painting you can see in the plantation if you go visit the plantation. Here's what the buzz of equipment and men around this area. And by now he's got like 100,000 men. I mean, he's got more men than he knows what to do with. And McClellan really doesn't do a very effective job in many of his battles. And so McClellan, is forced by Lincoln to do something. You're either going to take Richmond or come home, okay? So McClellan decides to go home. And so the only way he's going to go home is to see how to go home. And here the balloons come in again. So Allen now is tasked with clearing the James River. And so it's another period sketch. It's in the New York Public Library of being towed down the James River, looking at fortifications up and down this side of the river. There's old Fort Powhatan, which they thought was going to be a big problem, which comes to a narrows and again really can see everything in the water. But that had been abandoned. And so McClellan makes a decision, okay, we will evacuate this way. What we will do is we'll take all our wounded, put them in ships, and get them down here and get them through the James River, and then we're going to march our men back to Yorktown, and then take ships back to Washington, D.C. And that's what they did. And the Balloon Corps went with them. McClellan gets replaced by Burnside. Burnside, knows about the balloons, been acquainted with them with James Allen, and sets up the Balloon Corps in a burnt-out home, the Phillips home, which is opposite Fredericksburg. And here's another period sketch, beautiful sketch, and a nice flowing stream. This has also been found, and nice plaque is in the area. You can go down in that particular area and see it. Now, Fredericksburg is just really a slugfest. This is where observations from balloons could have been really useful. But what Burnside decided to do was have aides go up in the balloon that had never been up in the balloon. And one of his aides, Teal, would go up and make observations during the battle. Wrote a beautiful set of letters, wonderful diary entries, went nowhere, okay? The intelligence about what was happening and what's going on in the front here is a slaughter of an enormous number of Union men trying to take an area that was unassailable. In the meantime, after Burnside, a new general comes into town, and that is Joseph Hooker. Now, Hooker does all kinds of neat things. He actually establishes a place called the Central Intelligence Organization. This is really the seed of the idea of the CIA, where he had a group of men that would interpret intelligence. So the intelligence would be interviews from contraband. That'd be blacks that are leaving slavery and coming in and talking about what was happening, or captured Confederate soldiers that would tell them whatever they could, or balloon reports or scout reports, reports from a variety of generals, many things. Take that information and synthesize it, and then make it actionable. So that was one of the things he did. He also decided that he needed more rigor in the Balloon Corps, so he put this gentleman, Cyrus Comstock, who was a fabulous engineer, in control. And Lowe and Comstock just butted heads. In fact, first thing Comstock did, who was a career civil servant, It says, some of your books look pretty shady. All this funding that you got to pay your aeronauts, looks like you're using it to pay for the tents and the food and the hay for the horses of the reporters that are living with you and not paying your aeronauts. I'm going to have an IG investigation. So Comstock has an IG investigation going on at Lowe, and then cuts his pay, and then finds out his father works for Lowe and says, that's nepotism, we're not going to do that, fires his father. And so at every step along the way, the two of them really butt heads. But they're coming up to a really enormous battle. It's called the Battle of Chancellorsville. And Lowe, who now has decided in a big huff, fine, don't pay me at all, but at the end of this campaign, I'm done. So Lowe works for free for about a month. And then Lowe has three major balloon stations in these areas while this huge battle is going on, not only on the west side of Fredericksburg, but right here at Chancellorsville, where indeed Hooker gets beat and beat badly, and then indeed loses this particular battle to Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee cut his army, put part of it here, moved over here, cut his army in half again, and allowed Jackson to bring it around here. So he was incredibly creative and put men in the right locations. There's some aspects of what was going on for which this end run right here, which was really the death of Hooker in his area, was perhaps seen by one of the balloons. Lowe wanted to have a series of flags. So when the balloons are up, the generals could see the flags and get the intelligence. Hooker didn't like that idea. So Hooker stayed with the courier system. And a courier, right during the time that this force was moving cut from Lee, coming back around Jackson's group, and coming up to this side and slamming into this flanking maneuver is called slamming into the Union Army, may have been observed by one of the balloons. But indeed, it is true that the courier with the message does get shot and never makes it to Chancellorsville House where Hooker is, and the Central Intelligence Group that would take that information in. So Lowe leaves, and the battle is over. The last use of the balloons are observing the Army as it moves back into Washington, D.C., and then providing them intelligence as to where the Confederate Army is in case there's a counterattack as they're leaving, going back into Washington, D.C. Another really great use of the balloons, all right? And indeed, the Confederate Army stayed put in and around this area. With Lowe gone and no major supporter, since Allen didn't know who to talk to and how to really administer at a higher level of these functions, Comstock was sent to Grant in the West, and the administration of the Balloon Corps fell apart. And it was decided, okay, we're going to take all the balloon equipment and stick it in one of our warehouses, which they did. So here's my version of what I think that warehouse looked like. Okay, so here's indeed some of the balloon equipment coming into one of these storage areas. And it stayed there for a year. The next major battle, Gettysburg, certainly could have had balloons, certainly was anticipated that they were going to use balloons, but didn't. And that ended the Balloon Corps. Now, they stayed in storage for more than a year. And while they're in storage, because they always need more storage area, a clerk writes to his supervisor, the head of the department, I think, is Meigs, and in that letter he states quite clearly, we have these balloons. These 7 balloons are in storage, and they are rotting away, okay? Now, this causes great alarm. Wow, we ought to sell them, recoup our money before they rot away, right? Let's get rid of them, all right? And so, indeed, in April 1864, this ad appears that there's going to be public auction. Here's actually where it occurred, Rawlins Park, April the 18th, and sell everything. 7 balloons and fixtures, gas generators, the whole works, whatever he's got left. So Lowe is back in Philadelphia, reads this, and decides, okay, I'm not very happy about this. Really feel that the government owes me something still. And in particular, during the time he worked with Joseph Henry in making all kinds of observations, proving the worth of balloons, he felt he spent several $1,000s. So he wrote a letter to Joseph Henry saying, look, can you help me recoup my money? And I estimate it's about $3,000, and the government owes me this money. Okay, so Henry, now Lowe also talked to Secretary of State, Secretary of War. Nobody wanted to talk to Lowe anymore. And so Henry went to bat for Lowe, and they gave him one of the balloons, okay? They gave him the Washington. All the others were sold at auction. Lowe then, what Lowe does during the war and afterwards is go from place to place with the Washington, with the war balloon Washington, at fairs and makes money with rides, tethered rides up and down. And then, in fact, he's quite the showman. He actually marries a couple in a huge ceremony in New York with tremendous fanfare, with a lot of publicity. Even starts a pictorial magazine called Balloon Pictorial. But soon after that, he really decides that all the things that he did during the war in terms of the ability to create natural gas and the chemistry that he did, he could do to make better use by creating illumination gas and refrigeration services and ice making services, and he creates many patents, and he makes a fortune doing this. And indeed, he then goes out to Palo Alto area. It's actually Pasadena, where he lives, where most of his family lives. And he creates a hotel on top of a mountain and has a vehicular go up and down to bring people up to his hotel. And it goes bust, and he loses all his money, and he pretty well dies broken in 1913. But he's just really quite the showman all his life. Now, right after the war, Lowe, of course, has the Washington, and he gets notified that there's a war going on in South America, and they would like balloon observations. Brazil is fighting Paraguay. And so, would you come down to the Emperor of Brazil would like these balloon observations? Lowe decided, no, I'm really done with that. So he asks the Allen brothers, this is James Allen and his brother Ezra, who was also in the Balloon Corps, if they would do that. And they do. They go down and make some spectacular observations, allows the intelligence to be actionable. And the Brazilian army really goes through several battles and wins the war. And they make $10,000 for just a matter of a handful of months' worth of observing and work, nowhere near the strain that they went through as they did during the Civil War. Now, James Allen stays an aeronaut all his life. He actually dies from an accident, a freak accident, as he teaches his sons ballooning, and as the balloon went up, it was blown against a farm. He breaks his hip and then never recovers from that. Ezra Allen becomes a jeweler, okay? And lives out his life. And Wise and LaMountain both die in very public balloon accidents, very long distance balloon adventures that end in disaster. LaMountain falls out of a balloon, but Wise is never found in one of the Great Lakes, I believe. So, Henry, what happens to Henry? Well, everyone knows. He's going to continue on making observations of the climate. But what happens is a spectacular fire on January 24th, 1865, the burning of the Smithsonian Castle. And it's mostly the central castle that gets burnt. And and Henry loses his private papers. And recently, you know, Tom and I were back into the archives at the Smithsonian looking for the telegrams, the weather reports, and they are not there. So we believe they ended up in the fire, and that's an enormous amount of history that we lost that particular day. Henry, of course, gets elected as president of the National Academy, becomes the first president of the Philosophical Society of Washington, and dies in 1878. So I hope you enjoyed that little going back into history, seeing how Joseph Henry helped shepherd along the concepts of telegraph and balloons, the top things of the society of the day, and help make the first Air Force a reality. Thank you very much.
Questions,
Sounds good.
and I believe we have some people with microphones. And the procedure is to raise your hand and wait until a microphone comes to you, and then I'll call on the microphones by their color. And when you get a microphone and you're called on, please stand up, tell us your name, tell us whether you're a member. And
Stuart
ask
Reuter, a member. From a safety point of view, illuminating gas and hydrogen, I don't know about the spark possible from a telegraph, but certainly from a light system, whether it was whatever you
sounds
said it
dangerous to me
was,
too. You
sounds
bet.
like a
Yep.
very good way to have a massive explosion.
Right. The Balloon Corps made about 3,000 flights, and they only had one accident. And that accident actually was in a windstorm. When Hooker wanted Ezra Allen to go up and make an observation, and the Allen brothers refused, Hooker demanded that they do it. Ezra went up to about 500 feet. After they played out their whole line of 1,000 feet, that's as high as they got, and that wind was so high, and it ripped the seam of the Washington, and down it came. The fourth main was on the lines, and they took the lines upwind, and so instead of the balloon coming straight down, it actually came down at an angle, and Ezra survived that, okay? But that was their only accident. But they were very conscious of fire. In fact, they would guard the balloons at night. They'd have a group that would go around. There was many in the Confederacy tried to get close to the balloons to fire them, to make them explode, and that they were unsuccessful. But there wasn't any of that kind of disaster. Could have happened, but it didn't.
What about rifle fire?
Oh, plenty of holes, but no sparks. So Lowe, when he would get a detail of men, would love sailmakers. You know, he'd actually request, I need some men that can, that sewed sails. And so after some of their trips up, they would come down, be full of holes, and they would repair the balloons all the time. There's all kinds of accounts where literally cannonballs would go between the bottom of the balloon and the basket and miss them. All right? I mean, really some disastrous stuff. These men were shot at more than any other men in the service. And the real problem is the first 300 feet. You get above that, it's okay. So Lowe would sometimes inflate his balloon in the ravine, which he loved to do, and then play out the line as much as he could, and then move into a particular area while they're playing out the line, such that it minimized the shooting at the balloon. But they knew once they got going, they had to move up very quickly. This is why the men would move out really quickly to get the balloon up, because they had to get through that danger zone of first 300 feet.
Thank you. Dave Rabinowitz, past member, just returned to the area. I was wondering, when do hot air balloons start getting developed?
Well, the Confederacy actually did a couple hot air balloons because that was the cheapest and easiest thing they could do. And they would go up, and the aeronauts on the peninsula in particular would look at them and just laugh at them. They'd be up at 1,000 feet, and these things would hardly go up to 300 or 400 feet. So they were just ineffective and really not workable. But the concept of a hot air balloon was really what started balloons. Yeah, about 100 years earlier.
My name is Alexander Fitzhugh. I'm not a member. I'm actually an intern, so only in the city temporarily. It seems like it takes an amazing amount of bravery to make such a public target there. No way to defend yourself or hide. Were these men ever recognized officially for that bravery? Did they ever get like medals or memorials or anything along those lines other than, I guess, getting one of the balloons back?
No, they weren't.
Oh, it's a tragedy.
So the story of the Balloon Corps is really largely unknown. It's really largely unknown. And from many of our perspectives, they made some spectacular observations, a number of things, and could have been enormously valuable. In fact, when they were disbanded, not too long after that, Grant comes east and fights Lee and forces him down in the Richmond-Petersburg area, and they go into trenches. Trenches, perfect place for a balloon to go up, count the number, know where they are, how they're moving men around, find their weaknesses, and just punch a hole right through it. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and so they stayed in the trenches for 9 months, battling it out. And the balloons would have been just perfect, a perfect application. Didn't happen. Had that occurred, the balloons would have been, written about a lot. We know about them. Yeah, balloons were used in every war. Every war. Yes.
You mentioned that.
Name, whether you remember.
I'm sorry, Chris Pavlak. I'm just a visitor tonight.
Okay, good. Excellent.
But I'm an intelligence officer in the Marine Corps. I just was curious about some things. It seems like they're always logistically tied to the nearest body of water. Is that the case? And if they weren't, how operationally effective were they if they're outside of that, the closest body of water?
So they would have their wagon trains, and they could take their gas carts, and they can move with a unit. But to inflate a balloon, you needed a fast stream. So you'd always look for an area where a stream was, okay? Because you needed that water, not only to dilute your sulfuric acid, but it's also used in the process of cooling the gas as it gets dumped into it. So many of us have been around looking for these balloon stations, and that's the first place we go, is where the streams were. But that would be the only requirement of having water. You don't really... the concept of having rivers and things, then you could actually move a larger fraction of the material needed with more balloons on the flat top boat and get it in locations and then take it from there out into the field. But that's how that was used.
One more follow-up. Could they be retasked once deployed?
Would they, pardon?
Would they be retasked once deployed, or did they just go up with a certain observation task and then send that back?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends on what they decided to do. So if you had a series of men that wanted to go up, and Lowe would take 1 or 2 up, they'd be up for half an hour, come down, and then other men would come in, and he would take them up. But typically they'd go up and they'd stay up 8, 10, 12 hours overnight. I mean, they had the ability to be up for very long periods of time. This caused havoc all over the Confederate Army in terms of trying not to be seen, the nighttime problems that I mentioned. And in fact, at Gettysburg, Longstreet on the second day in the Battle of the Wheatfields went out of his way to move around, position his men, assuming that the balloons would go up at any time and he'd be spotted.
Question there with the blue microphone.
Hi, Chris Sorensen, brand new member. Thank you for the very interesting talk from our history, but you mentioned that we still use balloons today, obviously to study the weather and the atmosphere, but what is in store for balloons in the future? And would we use balloons on other planets, like even Jupiter with its big clouds?
Absolutely. So my last use of balloons was during the solar eclipse. We launched 55 balloons along the eclipse path. They went up to 120,000 feet, carried a planetary protection experiment with them, in addition to imaging the eclipse, the shaded land as it was coming into view through that whole path. We use balloons all the time. We have a balloon season. We launch them in the Antarctic. You know, sometimes they can stay up for months on end and circle the Antarctic and make observations of a variety of phenomena, astronomical phenomena. And we launch them in the United States and make a number of observations. So they're still used by NASA a lot. A lot of scientific research is still being done on them. Okay.
Any other questions? We have one up here. Can you please get the microphone to the person? And another person, get the microphone over there. Oh, James, sorry.
Hi, I'm James Heelan. I'm a member. The balloon core, getting communications up to the balloonists, if they're up there for 8, 10, 12 hours. I understand, you know, communicating air to ground, dropping things down the line. How do they get communications up?
Just pull down the balloon. If you want the aeronaut, you just tell them in, bring the balloon down, and that's what they would do. You know, Lowe's flag idea was great. It could have been very useful, but they didn't want to implement it. But.
So, Bob?
Bob Hershey, I'm a member. There are some indications that Joseph Henry or some of the others had a balloon influence later in their lives.
Ooh, good question. Tom, would you know that? He needs the microphone.
You need to speak.
So did Henry mess around with balloons in any way later after the Civil War?
Yeah, as Jim said, John Wise, for example, was close to Joseph Henry, and they had planned, in fact, for a series of scientific ascents that Henry could make, and they never did. Henry got busy, Wise got busy, but Wise did have a special balloon constructed that he named the Smithsonian. So, you know, as Jim said, Henry's relationship to the balloonists was fascinating. During the Civil War, Henry was the head of a specially appointed committee that considered technical innovations being suggested to the military. And they actually took a real interest in a strange kind of powered airship. They actually flew a model of it down in the basement of the castle. So, yeah, Henry was very much interested in flight and knew the balloonist.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, blue microphone there.
I'm Larry Patlin. I'm a guest. I found out about this talk via a meetup group. I wanted to congratulate you, Dr. Green, on this talk. I've been looking for years to hear someone talk about this whole issue, so I appreciate that. Now, I have a question. I'd heard many years ago that there was a dentist in Washington named Loomis who seemed to have done some type of aerial telegraphy from a balloon, but it seems like that's more of a legend. I was wondering if any of that ever came up in your research. Okay.
I'm familiar with that.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Hi, I'm a visitor. I was just curious, did either army shoot at the opposing army from the balloons?
Really good question. There was quite a bit of talk of dropping bombs from balloons. And this really suited John LaMountain because he would love to do free flights. He'd love to go up, cut his lines, and then fly over and then drop bombs. That's what he would like to do. But he never did, okay, never did. Nor did they take guns up and shoot down. They were always unarmed. Now, Lowe was always afraid of these free flights because he never wanted to be captured. He'd experienced that before, okay? And he knew that if he got caught, he'd be hung. They'd just take him out and hang him. So having 3 lines minimum on the gondola, absolutely had to do that every time he was in the balloon.
Savannah.
Hi, this is a question from the web from Caroline Coward. She's not a member, but she's in LA. And she would like to know, were the tether details ever attacked by the Confederate Army or were they well protected?
Good question. Hi, Carolyn. So I know Caroline. She's a librarian at JPL. It's very kind of her to dial in. So the answer to her question is, they were sort of protected because they were behind the lines, but they were always in danger. And what they were in danger of is as the shells were being fired at the balloon, they had to come down. Okay, and at Yorktown, a cannonball came down and hit a fence, which broke up, skewered one of the men on detail, killed him, and then also damaged the leg of one of the commanding generals that was commanding the detail at the time. That was the only accident that I'm aware of the detail. Now, there's at least 300 or 400 men over the course of the Civil War that were detailed to the Balloon Corps. There were several groups, like the 4th Maine. There's like 30 to 35 men out of the 4th Maine that they were constantly brought in. Lowe had trained them, and every time he was in the area that he needed balloon support, he'd request them, he'd get them. And the 4th Maine was just fabulous, really great group. So this set of men were very tight. They'd written several diaries that are just spectacular. And after Chancellorsville, they end up in Gettysburg in Devil's Den and in what's called the slaughter pen, and a lot of them were killed right then and there. So the danger was not in the Balloon Corps. That was really a cushy job. It was being on the front lines.
Oops.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Here we go.
Any more questions? If not, before you go, I'd like to present you with a small token of thanks for giving this talk, coming down here and sharing your time with us. It's a
my pleasure. Thank you so
framed
very
copy
much.
of the announcement of your talk, and also a signed copy of Volume 1 of the Philosophical Society of Washington Bulletin, which has reports on ballooning in it, believe it or not.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Before we go, there's just a few housekeeping items, after which we can adjourn to the social hour. So PSW depends on enthusiastic, active, and capable members and supporters and on our sponsors. And without all of you, PSW would not be able to continue and would not grow. So if you're not a member, please join. You can apply for membership on the PSW website, believe it or not, at www.pswscience.org. For those of you who know our old website, I commend to you to look at our new website, which I think is a very big improvement. There's now a large join button at the top right-hand corner of the home page, and you just click on that. It pulls up this screen, which tells you some of the benefits of membership. Has a little button to pull up the application. Pull up the application, fill it out, press the button, pay dues, and we will get back to you and almost certainly elect you to membership. So please join if you're not a member, and see us about maybe giving a little more if you are. If you have any questions, please see Lloyd Mitchell, our membership director, Lloyd, or corresponding secretary Robin Taylor, who is over there manning the live stream computer. By the way, if you are a member, the dues notice went out not long ago, and dues for the 2018-2019 fiscal year are now due. If you haven't paid, please do. Remember, PSW is a nonprofit educational organization, tax exempt under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, at least for the time being. Contributions are tax deductible to the extent permitted by law and the IRS. Let's see. Our next speaker and the 2,396th meeting will take place on September 21 at 8 p.m. right here in the Powell Auditorium. The speaker will be Juan Maldacena. He will be speaking on black holes and the structure of space-time. He's at the Institute for Advanced Study. He's a theoretical physicist who works on quantum field theory. Among his most significant work is the formulation of the Maldacena duality, a major advance in string theory and the theory of quantum gravity. His original paper on the duality is among the most highly cited publications in theoretical physics. Among a host of other awards, he's the MacArthur Fellow and a recipient of the 2018 Einstein Medal. After that, we have Zibby Turtle from Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, and she's going to tell us about the Dragonfly mission to Titan, followed by Charles Norton on NASA, of NASA, who's going to be talking about CubeSats and small sats, and I believe Charles runs the NASA program for small sats and CubeSats. Then on November 2, we have Jim Garvin and Melissa Traynor, now NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, speaking on Venus, and I think he's going to make the case of why we really do want to go back to Venus. Hopefully, he'll tell us a little bit about the technology required to get there and do something while we're there. On December 7th, we have Franz Cordova, the director of the National Science Foundation. And then on January 11th, we have one of my favorite colleagues, Lee Cronin, who will be speaking on something he'll tell us about later, but whatever it is, I can promise you it'll be very interesting and provocative. Lee is very lively, creative, and a lot of fun. So I recommend that you attend that, as well as the other ones. Social hours ends at 10:30, after which PSW members and their guests generally meet at the Fairfax Hotel Lounge, just across Mass Avenue. If you want to join us and you're not a member, please speak with Corresponding Secretary Robin Taylor, Membership Director Lloyd Mitchell, or me, sometime during the social hour. And please use the side entrances to exit the building, and I will accept a motion from a member to adjourn the 2,395th meeting of the Society to the Social Hour. Eric, do I have a second? Second. Okay, we got several seconds. Therefore, the meeting is adjourned.